The town of Abaddon Hollow seemed as if it had been lost to time, swallowed whole by the thick forests that surrounded it on all sides. The air always felt damp and heavy, as if the mist that hung over the town was somehow woven into the very essence of the place. The roads were narrow and uneven, carved out of dirt and gravel, leading to houses that sagged with age and neglect. Most of the homes were built long before the advent of modern architecture. Timber frames with dark, sloping roofs, their windows clouded with dust and forgotten memories. Despite the unmistakable sense of decay, there was something else that lingered in the air, something that crawled beneath the skin of anyone who dared stay too long. Abigail Harper hadn't planned on staying for more than a few days. She had come to Abaddon Hollow for what she thought would be a simple assignment, a human interest piece on small-town folklore for her blog, Wandering Myths. She had always been drawn to stories like this, places steeped in mystery, where old traditions and superstitions lived on despite the passage of time. But as she drove into town that late October afternoon, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly off about this place. The trees here seemed taller than any she had seen before, their gnarled branches twisting in unnatural ways, casting long shadows over the road. The deeper she drove into the hollow, the more the light dimmed, as though the trees were swallowing the daylight whole. Her car's headlights flickered briefly, and for a moment she thought she saw a figure standing just beyond the tree line watching her. But when she blinked, the figure was gone, leaving nothing but the pale mist that curled around the trees like grasping fingers. By the time she reached the town square, a strange silence had settled over everything. The town seemed deserted, though it was only late afternoon. A handful of shops lined the square, their faded signs swaying in the breeze. A small grocery store, a hardware shop, a post office. None of them showed signs of life. Abigail pulled her car into the lot next to the inn, the only building that looked remotely well kept. Its dark wood siding and peaked roof gave it an ominous feel, but it was the only place to stay. She stepped out of the car, shivering as the cold air bit at her skin. The sky had taken on an eerie copper hue, as though the sun was setting too soon, casting everything in a strange, otherworldly light. She grabbed her bag from the back seat and made her way to the inn's entrance, the gravel crunching underfoot, the only sound that broke the silence. As she approached the door, it creaked open before she could knock. An older woman stood in the threshold, her gray hair pulled back into a tight bun, her eyes sharp and unwelcoming. "You must be Abigail Harper," the woman said, her voice roughened by years of smoke, or perhaps something more sinister. "I'm Mrs. Granger, the innkeeper. Come in before the night gets colder." Abigail smiled politely and stepped inside, but the warmth she had hoped to find was missing. The inn's interior was dimly lit by a single chandelier, its bulbs flickering faintly. The air smelled of old wood and something faintly metallic, and the floor creaked beneath her feet as she followed Mrs. Granger to the front desk. "I hope you don't plan on staying long," Mrs. Granger said abruptly, as she handed Abigail a tarnished brass key. Her voice was matter-of-fact, but the words held an edge of warning. "This isn't a place for people who don't belong." Abigail frowned. "I'm just here for a few days," she said, trying to brush off the woman's strange comment. "I'm writing a piece on the local folklore, the witching hour, I think it's called." Mrs. Granger's expression darkened instantly. Her lips tightened into a thin line, and she glanced over her shoulder as though someone, or something, might be listening. "That's not something to talk about lightly," Mrs. Granger whispered, leaning in closer. Her breath was stale, tinged with the scent of tobacco. People around here don't take kindly to outsiders digging into things best left buried. Abigail's curiosity flared despite the warning. It was exactly this kind of response that piqued her interest. Still, she nodded and decided not to press further, at least not with Mrs. Granger. She took her key and headed up the narrow staircase, which groaned under her weight with each step. Her room was small but serviceable, a single bed with a heavy dark quilt, a wooden chair by the window, and a nightstand with a tarnished lamp. Abigail set her bag down and moved to the window, parting the thin curtains to look out over the town square. It was even quieter now, if that was possible. The mist had thickened, and the few street lamps that lined the square flickered weakly, barely cutting through the fog. For a moment, she thought she saw movement near the edge of the woods, but it was hard to tell through the shifting mist. Her eyes lingered on the clock tower in the center of the square, its face cracked and worn with age, the hands forever frozen at 3:13. She shivered and stepped back from the window, trying to shake the creeping unease that had been building since her arrival. She had been to plenty of small towns before, and most of them had their quirks, but there was something different about Abaddon Hollow. The air here felt thick with something, fear perhaps, or maybe something darker, something that lurked just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to strike. As she unpacked her things, her phone buzzed with a message. It was from her editor, reminding her to be careful and not get too wrapped up in the local legends. Abigail laughed softly to herself. If only her editor knew how serious these people were about their superstitions. But that's what made the story so compelling, wasn't it? She was determined to uncover whatever secrets Abaddon Hollow was hiding. Later that evening, Abigail ventured out for a quick walk around the square. The fog had grown thicker, swirling in ghostly patterns as it clung to the ground. She pulled her jacket tighter around herself and walked briskly past the empty shops. The town felt dead, but she knew that somewhere people were hiding behind closed doors, shuttering themselves in for the night. As she passed the town's old church, she heard footsteps behind her. They were slow, deliberate, echoing against the cobblestones. She turned, but no one was there. The street was empty, the fog shifting like a living thing. Her heart quickened as the sound continued, growing louder, closer. She walked faster, her breath puffing out in quick bursts of cold air, but the footsteps followed, matching her pace. Panic rising in her chest, Abigail broke into a run, her boots slipping on the damp cobblestones. She rounded the corner toward the inn, desperate for the safety of her room. The footsteps followed, relentless and heavy, but when she finally reached the inn and threw herself inside, slamming the door behind her, the sound stopped. She stood there, panting and trembling, her back pressed against the door. Mrs. Granger was sitting in the small parlor, her gaze fixed on Abigail with a knowing look in her eyes. "They've noticed you," Mrs. Granger said softly, her voice low and cold. "The Hollow doesn't like newcomers. It won't let you leave so easily now." Abigail's pulse pounded in her ears, and for the first time since arriving in Abaddon Hollow, she felt the true weight of her decision to come here. Something was watching her, something ancient and terrible, and deep down she knew Mrs. Granger was right. Abaddon Hollow wasn't just a town with a dark past, it was a place trapped in a curse, and now that she was here, it wasn't going to let her go. The night after her unsettling arrival in Abaddon Hollow, Abigail Harper lay awake in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling. Every creak of the floorboards or whisper of wind against the window made her pulse quicken. Her thoughts kept returning to the ominous words of Mrs. Granger, the innkeeper, and to the strange sound of footsteps that had followed her through the empty streets. There was no logical explanation for what she had experienced, but then again, Abaddon Hollow didn't seem to follow the rules of logic. She finally drifted off into a fitful sleep, only to wake abruptly sometime later, her skin cold and clammy. She sat up in bed, her heart hammering in her chest. The room was dark except for the faint glow of moonlight seeping in through the curtains. But the strangest thing was the clock on her nightstand. Its face glowed softly, the hands ticking toward 3:13 a.m. As they clicked into place, Abigail's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't explain why, but the sight filled her with dread. She felt an overwhelming compulsion to get out of bed and look outside. Throwing the covers aside, she walked on trembling legs toward the window. The town square lay below, bathed in the faint light of the moon. At first glance, it was as empty as before, but then Abigail noticed a flicker of movement at the edge of the square, near the clock tower. She squinted, leaning closer to the glass. A small figure stood in the mist. No, several figures. Children, pale and silent, staring up at her window with hollow eyes. Abigail stumbled back with a gasp, clutching her chest. She blinked and the figures were gone, leaving nothing but swirling mist in their place. Her heart raced and she had to remind herself to breathe. The town's legends were starting to bleed into her mind, mixing dreams with reality in a way she couldn't control. For hours she remained awake, unable to close her eyes. By morning she knew what she had to do. The answer lay in the past, in the stories that no one in Abaddon Hollow wanted to talk about. The key to the town's curse was tied to the witching hour, to the mysterious disappearances that had haunted the town for decades. The next day, Abigail ventured to the town's small library. The building was tucked away at the far end of the square, barely noticeable behind overgrown hedges and crumbling brick. The interior was just as worn down as the rest of the town, with shelves lined with dusty, forgotten books. But it was there, in the archives, that Abigail found the first real glimpse into the town's dark history. Buried deep in the library's old records were yellowed newspaper clippings, brittle with age, detailing the horrors that had befallen the town. The most haunting stories were about the missing children. On Halloween night in 1965, 13 children had vanished without a trace. Abigail stared at the old black and white photos, her skin crawling as she looked at their faces. Some smiled shyly for the camera, while others had wide, curious eyes. They had all been between the ages of 7 and 12, all taken from their homes on the same night. No bodies were ever found and no clues were ever uncovered. The only connection between them, according to the town's whispers, was that they had been last seen near the clock tower, just before 3:13 a.m. The locals believed that they had been taken by something not of this world, something dark that roamed the hollow during the witching hour. As Abigail read on, she discovered another chilling detail. Several eyewitnesses had reported seeing a shadowy figure lurking near the edge of the woods on the night the children disappeared. A figure that had no form, no face, only the vague outline of a man. The townsfolk had given this entity a name: the Shade. The Shade had become something of a legend in Abaddon Hollow, a story told to frighten children into staying indoors at night. But as Abigail delved deeper into the town's records, she began to wonder if there was more to it than just a story. There were other accounts of disappearances going back nearly a century, all occurring during the witching hour, and all tied to sightings of the shadowy figure. It was then that she stumbled upon the journal of Declan O'Brien, the preacher whose daughter Lydia had been one of the 13 children taken in 1965. Declan had kept meticulous notes in the months following her disappearance, notes that chronicled his descent into madness. His grief had driven him to obsessive research into the town's dark past, and eventually to the belief that the town was cursed by the Shade, an ancient malevolent force that demanded blood sacrifices in exchange for the town's continued existence. Declan's journal entries grew increasingly frantic, his handwriting becoming more erratic as he wrote of seeing Lydia in his dreams, hearing her voice calling to him from the woods. Abigail's hands trembled as she turned the brittle pages of Declan's journal. The preacher had claimed that he had found a way to communicate with his lost daughter, a ritual performed at the clock tower during the witching hour. But whatever Declan had attempted, it had led to his own demise. He was found hanging from a tree in the churchyard with his eyes gouged out and a twisted smile on his face, as though he had seen something terrible before he died. Lydia O'Brien, like the other missing children, had never been found, but the townspeople said that on certain nights, when the mist was thick and the air was heavy with the presence of something otherworldly, you could still hear the laughter of children echoing from the woods, and if you followed that sound, if you let yourself be drawn into the forest by their ghostly voices, you would never return. Abigail felt a shiver creep up her spine. Could it be possible that the children were still out there, trapped somewhere between this world and the next? Were they doomed to wander the hollow forever, lost in the grasp of the Shade? That night, as Abigail lay in bed once more, she couldn't shake the image of Lydia O'Brien, a pale girl with long dark hair and hollow eyes, calling to her from the edge of the woods. The wind outside howled, and the mist crept against the window panes. She closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but her dreams were plagued by visions of the missing children, their voices whispering to her from the darkness. "Help us," they said. "We're still here." She woke suddenly, drenched in sweat, her heart pounding in her chest. The clock on her nightstand showed 3:13 a.m. again, its hands stuck as if mocking her. And in that moment, Abigail realized something. The town's curse wasn't just some old legend to scare children into staying indoors on Halloween night. It was real, and it was far more terrifying than she had imagined. There was a dark force at work in Abaddon Hollow, and it wasn't done claiming its victims. Whatever was happening during the witching hour, it was more than just the disappearance of children. It was a ritual, a pact made with something ancient and evil, and it was far from over. The sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway outside her door, slow and deliberate. Abigail's breath caught in her throat as she sat up, listening. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped just outside her room. She stared at the door, her pulse racing. She half expected the door to creak open, to see a shadowy figure standing in the threshold, but after a moment, the footsteps receded, fading into silence. Abigail shuddered and lay back down, pulling the covers up to her chin. Sleep was impossible now, but one thing was certain. She couldn't leave Abaddon Hollow until she uncovered the truth. The missing children were calling to her, their voices growing louder with each passing night, and she had no choice but to follow where they led. The days passed in a thick, oppressive blur for Abigail Harper. The once quaint town of Abaddon Hollow now felt like a living, breathing thing, its darkness seeping into her bones. Her investigation had consumed her, drawing her deeper into the unsettling mysteries that lingered at the heart of the town. Sleep became an elusive, bitter memory. Each night she woke at 3:13 a.m., sharp, heart pounding, skin cold with dread. Her dreams were filled with the faces of the missing children, their hollow eyes and whispered pleas for help. But what haunted her most was the ticking sound that filled her room, always beginning just before the clock hit that cursed hour. She knew she couldn't ignore it any longer. The town's old clock tower held the key. It had become an obsession. Everywhere she went, its presence loomed over her, a decaying monolith that cast long shadows over the town square. Every time she looked at it, she felt a sharp pull in her chest, like it was calling to her. On the third night, after yet another nightmare and the echoing tick-tick-tick that haunted her even in her waking hours, Abigail knew she had no choice. She had to go to the clock tower. She had to uncover what dark secret it concealed. The fog hung low over the town as Abigail stepped out of the inn just after sunset. The sky was overcast and the air was sharp and cold. The streets were deserted, as they always were after dark. The town's residents had learned long ago not to linger outside when the shadows grew long. Abigail could feel eyes on her, though she saw no one as she walked. She quickened her pace, pulling her coat tighter around her as the clock tower rose before her like a dark sentinel. The tower stood at the center of the square, an ancient structure with weathered stone walls and a sagging roof. Ivy crawled up its sides, winding into the cracks of the stone like dark veins. The clock face, cracked and stained with age, was stuck at 3:13, just as it had been for years, ever since the night the 13 children had disappeared. Abigail hesitated at the base of the tower, her heart pounding in her chest. The door before her was heavy and wooden, reinforced with rusting iron bands. It looked as though it hadn't been opened in decades, but as she reached for the handle, the door swung open with a groan, as if it had been waiting for her. The air inside was stale and damp, smelling of mold and decay. Abigail stepped inside, feeling the cold stone floor beneath her feet, and the door slammed shut behind her with a deafening thud. She jumped, her heart leaping into her throat, but when she turned, the door was closed tightly. A shiver ran down her spine, but she forced herself to keep moving, stepping into the tower's darkened interior. The walls were lined with ancient gears and rusting metal mechanisms that had long since fallen into disrepair. Cobwebs hung like ghostly curtains in the corners, and dust coated every surface. The only light came from the narrow slits of moonlight that slipped through the tower's cracks, illuminating patches of the floor in silvery beams. At the center of the room stood the clock's massive pendulum, frozen in place, its once shining brass now tarnished and dull. Abigail approached it cautiously, her breath quickening. Something about the pendulum felt wrong, like it was radiating a strange energy. She could almost hear a faint humming in the air, as if the clock was trying to come to life once again. As she stood there, Abigail's gaze was drawn to the floor beneath the pendulum. The wooden boards were old and rotting, but something caught her eye. Scratches, faint but unmistakable, etched into the wood in the shape of symbols. Kneeling down, she traced her fingers over them, recognizing them as part of some kind of ritual. The symbols were ancient, older than anything she had seen in her research. They seemed to form a circle around the base of the pendulum, and in the center of the circle was a faded, bloody handprint. Her stomach turned at the sight. A chill swept through the room, and the air grew heavy, pressing down on her from all sides. Abigail swallowed hard, trying to steady her nerves, but the atmosphere in the tower had shifted. It felt as though the walls were closing in on her, the darkness growing thicker, suffocating. The sound of ticking filled the air again, loud and insistent, like the beating of a heart. But the clock was still frozen, its hands locked in place. She stood, backing away from the pendulum, and as she did, she heard something else, a voice. It was faint at first, barely a whisper, but it grew louder, clearer. "Lydia!" The voice was a child's, soft and eerie, calling out a name that chilled Abigail to the core. "Lydia!" She turned sharply, her eyes scanning the room, but no one was there. The voice came again, echoing from the shadows. "Lydia, help us!" Abigail's pulse quickened as she realized the voice wasn't alone. More whispers joined in, overlapping and indistinct, filling the air with a chorus of disembodied pleas. The voices of the missing children. She could hear them now, all around her, their words slipping through the cracks in the walls, seeping through the floorboards. "Find us. Save us. Trapped." The words grew louder, more desperate. Abigail pressed her hands to her ears, but the voices only intensified, surrounding her like a swarm. Her vision blurred as the room seemed to spin around her. She stumbled backward, trying to escape the noise, but her foot caught on something, and she fell hard against the floor. The whispers ceased abruptly as she hit the ground. For a moment there was silence, oppressive and thick. But then she heard it, the creak of the old gears overhead, the slow grinding of metal on metal. Abigail's eyes shot up to the clock's face. The hands had started to move. Slowly, agonizingly, the hands inched forward, creeping past 3:13 for the first time in decades. The ticking grew louder and louder until it filled the room, echoing off the stone walls. Abigail scrambled to her feet, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she watched the hands move closer to midnight. With each tick, the air in the tower grew colder, the shadows deeper. And then she saw them, figures emerging from the darkness, pale and spectral, their faces gaunt and hollow-eyed. They were children, their bodies twisted and contorted, their mouths open in silent screams. Abigail backed away, her hands trembling. The children moved toward her slowly, their eyes fixed on her, their expressions pleading. She could feel their anguish, their despair. These were the missing children, the ones who had been taken all those years ago. But they were no longer human. Whatever had claimed them had twisted them into something dark, something unnatural. "Help us," they whispered again, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of fear and pain. "You have to stop it, before it's too late." Abigail's heart pounded in her chest as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. She had come here for answers, but now, standing in the presence of the lost children, she realized that the truth was far more terrifying than she had imagined. The clock tower wasn't just a symbol of the town's curse, it was the heart of it, the center of the darkness that had been growing in Abaddon Hollow for generations. The hands of the clock reached midnight with a deafening clang, and the tower seemed to tremble. The air pulsed with energy, and a shadow moved across the room, a dark, formless mass that twisted and writhed, growing larger and darker with each passing second. It was the Shade. Abigail could feel its presence, malevolent and cold, as it slithered closer to her, its shape barely discernible in the thick darkness. Panic seized her, and she turned to run, but the tower door was sealed shut, trapping her inside. The shadow crept closer, tendrils of darkness stretching out toward her. Abigail's mind raced, trying to remember the ritual symbols she had found in Declan O'Brien's journal. There had to be a way to stop this. There had to be a way to break the curse. Desperate, she began to chant the words she had memorized from the preacher's notes. Her voice wavered, but she kept going, speaking faster as the darkness closed in around her. The shadow paused for a moment as though it was listening, but then it surged forward with renewed force. Abigail screamed as the shadow engulfed her, wrapping her in a suffocating embrace of darkness. The children's voices echoed in her mind, their cries growing louder, more frantic. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the shadow recoiled. The chanting had worked. Abigail collapsed to the floor, gasping for air as the darkness retreated, swirling back into the corners of the room. The clock's ticking slowed, and the hands froze once more at 3:13. The children's faces faded into the mist, their whispers growing faint. But the town's curse wasn't broken. Not yet. The shade still lingered in the darkness, waiting for its next opportunity, and Abigail knew with a sinking dread that her time was running out. The witching hour was far from over. The wind outside howled like a beast starved of flesh, its mournful wails rattling the old windows of the inn as Abigail Harper prepared herself for the coming night. She had spent days digging through the town's decaying history, unraveling the twisted secrets that had long festered in Abaddon Hollow. The witching hour was no mere superstition, it was a binding pact, an ancient curse that demanded sacrifice. And tonight, Halloween night, was when the dark ritual would reach its horrifying climax. Abigail stood at the small window of her room, staring out at the creeping mist that had blanketed the town. Her breath fogged the glass, and beyond it, the square was still and empty. But the silence felt wrong. It was as though the entire town held its breath, waiting for something unspeakable to unfold. Deep in the woods, just beyond the town's edge, she could almost hear the whispers, the faint cries of the lost children, calling for release. Her heart pounded in her chest as she fastened her coat and slipped the journal of Declan O'Brien into her bag. Every instinct told her to flee, to run as far from Abaddon Hollow as her legs could carry her, but she knew that leaving was no longer an option. The town wouldn't let her go. The shade had marked her, just as it had marked the others. If she stayed, there was a chance, a slim one, that she could stop the curse. If she fled, she knew that whatever force had taken the 13 children would claim her too. The night outside was thick with fog and shadows as Abigail stepped into the square, the sharp scent of decaying leaves clinging to the air. The clock tower loomed above her, its dark spire piercing the sky like a dagger. For a moment the world seemed to tilt, and Abigail swayed on her feet. She could feel it, the pull of the witching hour, the way time itself seemed to slow, distorting reality. It was as though the very fabric of the night was being unraveled, torn apart by forces beyond her understanding. As she crossed the square, her footsteps echoing against the cobblestones, she spotted a figure waiting in the mist. Ezra Corwin, the man who had once been one of the children taken by the shade, emerged from the shadows. His face was gaunt, his eyes haunted by something dark and unfathomable. He had returned to the town years ago, cursed to wander the hollow as a servant of the dark force that controlled it. "You shouldn't have come," Ezra said, his voice hoarse with fear. "It's too late now." Abigail met his gaze, her resolve hardening. "There has to be a way to stop it. I've found something." In Declan O'Brien's journal. A ritual. Ezra shook his head, his eyes filled with sorrow. The ritual won't save you. It never worked before. It won't work now. The shade, it's too strong. You'll only anger it. But Abigail wouldn't be swayed. If I don't try, more will be taken. The curse will go on, and the town will continue to feed the shade. I can't let that happen. Ezra's expression twisted with regret. You don't understand. You can't fight what's already been claimed. It hungers for you, Abigail, and once it has you, there's no coming back. Abigail's pulse quickened, but she refused to let fear control her. She had come this far, and she couldn't turn back now. She pushed past Ezra, her eyes fixed on the clock tower, which loomed over the square like a monument to the town's sins. Ezra called after her, but his voice was lost in the growing wind as Abigail ascended the stairs to the tower. The door creaked open under her hand, just as it had before. The interior of the tower was even colder than she remembered, the air thick with the scent of damp stone and ancient decay. The gears of the clock lay dormant, rusted and forgotten, but the pendulum, immense and menacing, hung from the ceiling like a blade waiting to fall. Abigail crossed the threshold into the heart of the tower, her breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. The symbols on the floor, the ones she had discovered during her previous visit, glowed faintly in the dim light, as though they had been charged with dark energy. She knelt before them, pulling Declan's journal from her bag, her fingers trembling as she flipped to the page that described the ritual. The words were ancient, scrawled in a language that twisted and turned in ways that hurt to look at, but she had memorized them. She had to believe they would work. She had to believe that this would be enough. As she began to chant, the air in the tower shifted. The temperature plummeted, and the shadows in the corners of the room began to move. Abigail's voice shook as she spoke the words, but she forced herself to continue. The ticking of the clock resumed, slow and methodical, its rhythm pounding in her ears like the beat of a heart. The hands on the clock face inched forward, each second stretching into an eternity. Then she felt it, a presence in the room with her. The darkness seemed to coalesce, swirling into a mass of blackness that hovered just out of reach. Watching, Abigail could feel the malevolent gaze of the shade upon her, its hunger palpable in the air. The shadows shifted again, and out of the darkness stepped the children. 13 pale, ghostly figures, their hollow eyes locked onto Abigail. Their mouths opened, but no sound emerged. They simply stared, pleading silently, their faces twisted with sorrow and pain. Lydia O'Brien stood among them, her hair matted with dirt, her dress tattered and stained with blood. Her dark eyes bored into Abigail's, a look of infinite sadness etched into her features. Abigail's heart ached for them, for what they had endured, but she couldn't allow herself to falter now. She continued the ritual, her voice growing stronger as the air hummed with dark energy. But the shade, that swirling vortex of malevolence, grew larger, feeding off the children's despair. As she chanted, the pendulum above her began to move, slowly at first, but gaining momentum with each swing. Abigail's breath caught in her throat as she realized that the clock was no longer frozen. It was alive again, ticking toward midnight. The wind outside grew fiercer, rattling the tower, and a deep, guttural voice seemed to rise from the shadows. It was the shade, speaking to her, taunting her. "Foolish girl," it whispered, its voice cold and hollow. "You think you can stop me. I have taken this town. It is mine. You are mine." Abigail gritted her teeth, her voice rising above the howling wind and the ticking clock. She would not let this thing claim her, not without a fight. She would not let the children's suffering continue. The pendulum swung faster, the ticking growing louder and louder until it was deafening. The shade surged forward, its dark tendrils wrapping around her, pulling her toward its cold, suffocating embrace. Abigail screamed, the force of it shaking her to her core. The children watched in silence, their eyes wide with fear and resignation. But just as the darkness closed in, Abigail's voice reached a crescendo, the final words of the ritual tearing from her throat. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The shadows recoiled, shuddering as the symbols on the floor flared to life, glowing with a bright, searing light. The shade let out a wail, a sound of pure rage and agony, and the tower shook violently. The pendulum swung faster, erratically, and the ticking clock ground to a halt. The darkness began to unravel, dissipating like smoke in the wind as the power of the ritual took hold. The shade screamed once more before it was consumed by the light, its form disintegrating into nothingness. The children faded with it, their sorrowful faces finally at peace. Lydia smiled, a faint, ghostly smile, before she too vanished, leaving Abigail alone in the tower, her body trembling with exhaustion. The clock had stopped, frozen once more at 3:13. The witching hour was over. Abigail collapsed to the floor, her vision blurring as she fought to stay conscious. The town had been freed, at least for now, but the cost had been great. She could feel it in her bones, in the air around her. The curse was not entirely gone. The darkness would return one day. But for tonight, Abaddon Hollow was at peace. Outside, the first rays of dawn began to break through the fog, casting the town in a pale golden light. Abigail lay on the cold stone floor, her body aching, but a small smile tugged at her lips. She had survived. For now. As she drifted into unconsciousness, the sound of a distant ticking echoed in the silence. The clock, it seemed, was waiting for the next witching hour.